be here. I didn't know. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies. And today, Lynn said this is an informal discussion, and I can talk about anything that I want. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where I come from, sort of position, right? And then also talking about sort of Asian diasporas in Latin America in general. So the theme, I think, of my talk, and also the theme of the artwork that I'm hoping to talk about at the end, Lara Fong Prosper's Donde Nació, where he was born, is el tiempo is circular, right? The time is circular. The time goes around and round and round. And so I'm hoping to get back to that at the end of this discussion. First of all, I want to say this exhibit in general is fascinating. I love it. It brings our attention to the diversity of Latin America and the Caribbean, of this topic of mestizaje, right? Where you have the intermixing of ethnicities and identity throughout the region. And the Asian diasporas has had a long history and tradition in every country in the region. And here within this exhibit, we see its presence in Latin America. I also think as you look around the whole entire exhibit, that the artwork is just aesthetically and conceptually exquisite and magnificent. So I just want to say, and this is more informally, that unfortunately, as the Associate Director of Latin American Latinx Studies, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know too much about the Asian diasporas in Latin America. In fact, you know, my training is more in political science with a master's in Latin American Latinx Studies. So that has had me focus a lot on sort of political economic trajectory of Latin America since the 1800s to this day. And I teach a lot about Latin American politics. And so it's terrible that I haven't focused on the Asian diasporas in Latin America as part of this political economic trajectory. And I've been reading, so it's this exhibit, as well as students in the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies program, that brought to my attention the importance of the Asian diasporas in Latin America. Last semester, we had the privilege to have a special event with Evelyn Hugh-Hart, who I think will be coming later on this semester, from Brown University, who's the foremost scholar on Asian diasporas in Latin America. So I looked to her research to help inform me a bit more about the migration. And so the first topic that before we begin talking about this particular piece, Lara Fong Prosper, and I apologize if some of this might overlap with the opening, but I think it's important for people to think about this as well, is to think about diasporas in Latin America. And just briefly saying sort of what Evelyn Hugh-Hart sort of points out is sort of three major diasporas, those of South Asian descent, right, or Indian Asian, those of Chinese, and then those of Japanese descent, right? And when she came, and you can take a look, I think it's up on the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies YouTube page, or it will be by the end of this week. She gave a presentation. I encourage all of you to visit our center site to see that presentation. She points out these three sort of big trends or diasporas, Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian, that all travel to Latin America, either over the Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean. And a lot of people think that a lot of these diasporas came in the mid-1800s, but she points out that Hugh-Hart basically traces this back to the 1500s, where you saw trade routes setting up in the 1500s with China and New Spain or Mexico through the Philippines, because China desired at that time silver from Latin America, and Latin America desired the silk, porcelain, spices, ivory, and all these other goods from China that you still see today in Latin America in the churches if you visit them. So it's fascinating that, you know, this diaspora, these migrations aren't something new, but really date back to centuries. And you see Asian diasporas in all countries in Latin America, whether it's Brazil, Panama, Peru, Argentina, Mexico. So you'll see that with the artwork that is actually captured here if you come visit this exhibit. So let's go over the overview of diasporas. The first thing I did when I was researching for this talk, I thought, well, what are the statistics today in Latin America about the current Asian diasporas in Latin America? And honestly, it's hard to find accurate numbers. But what I did find that on a whole, about 1% of Latin America and Caribbean, which is about 663 million persons, right, identifies as Asian, over 4 million persons. And if you look at Peru, for instance, there's 32 million people in Peru, and I would say, yeah, about over 1.2% of that 32 million identify as Asian, right? If you look at Panama, the country that Lara Fong prospers from, 5% of Panama, and Panama is a small country, of 3.9 million, identify as Asian American. I think personally, when I was looking through statistics and looking through some reports, I think the numbers are on the lower side, but this is what I was able to find in terms of current statistics, right? So let's sum up quickly the diasporas in general. And the first diaspora I'm not going to talk too much about, but I'll just point out is the South Asian Indian diaspora, because we have professors who are experts of this here at Penn. But the Indians or South Asians contain, as you know, many religious and ethnic groups: Muslim, Jain, Sikhs, Parsis, just to name a few. However, Hindus are the majority, and the largest diasporas of Hindus are in the United States. But you also have many and also people who identify as Muslim, 500,000 from this region in Guyana and Trinidad, and over 115,000 in Suriname. Right? Most arrived as contract laborers for plantations after slavery at the end of the 18th and 19th century. And since the 1980s, some of the diasporas in this region, in the British Caribbean, from South Asia, have migrated to other nodes throughout the hemisphere, including, for instance, New York. If you're interested in learning more, I think also another guest artist that'll be coming up is Professor Rupa Pillai of the Asian American Studies, who's an expert on this topic and teaches many classes. One of the artworks that I'm not going to talk too much about, but is behind the camera, is Suchitra's Matais. I apologize for mispronouncing it. Beautiful tapestry from, who's is basically, she's from Guyana, but this is a beautiful tapestry of Indian migrants who arrived in British Guyana over a century ago and worked as indentured servants, partly reflecting that. But I wanted to point that out. If you get a chance, there's a beautiful description of that on the wall if you come and visit this, and also that she is a Penn alum. Now, Japanese, when I did some research in terms of the Japanese diaspora, I returned back to Evelyn Hudy-Hart's, her readings and also the video that we have of her. And she also talks about, this is nothing, a lot of people think that most of the Japanese had come to Latin America in the 1800s. It's just no, actually you see groups of Japanese that came to Latin America starting in the 1600s. And in particular, Evelyn Hudy-Hart gives a story how you had a group of Japanese who had converted to Christianity under the Spanish Empire, coming to Mexico in the 1600s. A small group of them stayed there and resided in Guadalajara. But then the large-scale Japanese migration does occur in the mid-1800s, right? Especially when Japan opens itself up to the world after 1868. And you see many Japanese going to California, some are going to Hawaii, and there's a Hawaii Kingdom contract with the Japanese government. And you see you working on sugar plantations for sort of 3-year contracts. But then by the end of the 1800s, in terms of the Americas, Japanese migrants had traveled all across the Americas, including Guatemala. Some of them coming from Hawaii, Mexico, Peru, and South America. Again, similar to the other migrations, many worked as agricultural workers, but some included students, businessmen, sailors, journalists, and professionals. You also have a large number coming to Brazil by the early 1900s, and then all over Latin America, including Colombia, Chile, Paraguay. So I was interested in particular when I was reading about the Japanese diaspora, maybe it's my sort of interest in political science in general, is the unfortunate experience, right, that we saw happening to Japanese immigrants here in the United States during World War II. And I was actually surprised to learn of how that unfortunate experience, the horrors really of the internment camps also were tied to Japanese immigrants in Peru, because the United States was scared of anybody of Japanese descent in the Americas during World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They called up, their Peruvian officials and whatnot, and put pressure on Peru to really create, restrictions, like Japanese weren't allowed out after, 1941 in groups of 3, for instance, in Lima, Peru. Then they took over 1,800 Japanese immigrants from Peru and deported them here to Texas, right, where they had remained. And they shaved, awful stories, they shaved their heads and treated them horribly on a boat. And actually the Japanese immigrants that were from the United States were released from the internment camps before the Japanese immigrants that had come from Peru during this time, this 1,800. And only 75 had gone back to Peru after, and this was in 1946, that finally they were released from the Crystal City, Texas internment camp. So it was really harrowing experience, and I thought it was awful. Even before 1941, in the midst of the War of the Pacific, you saw nativist attitudes, even among Peruvians, towards Japanese immigrants in Peru. Now, Evelyn Hudy-Hart, who does a great job of explaining those, she says through, more assimilation and miscegenation, and also just in general, you read, you see now, she would argue that there's less nativism towards Japanese immigrants now, obviously in Peru, than there were in the past. But I did read, obviously, before I even started researching this, when I thought about Asian diaspora to Latin America, the first thing that came to my mind was as a political scientist, was the famous and somewhat notorious Alberto Fujimori from 1990 to 2000 in Peru, who led a self-coup, we say auto golpe, and also had, sanctioned a lot of corruption and whatnot. And so during that time period, yeah, there was a rise of nativism towards Japanese immigrants in Peru, but things are, but I read there's about 100, I think it's 160,000. There are many, it's growing population. And I encourage you to continue reading about it today, and not only in Peru, but throughout the Latin America. I don't have time to talk about this right now. If we have time later on, but Carlos Ronzi Tanaka, who has a nice, his artwork, he's of Japanese, English, and Peruvian descent. And he has a ceramic there. And I don't think, a lot of his ceramic talks about themes of memory and migration. You can take a look at the website here and also visit that ceramic over there. I know one of his famous installations in 1994 was based on concepts of memory, journey, and displacement, where he used the image of crab, which was very interesting to me, as a migratory symbol, right? Because he had seen this crabs on Cerro Azul Beach in Peru, but also as using this as a symbol, and there's a monument, and sort of a homage to Japanese immigrants in Peru. Okay, finally, the waves of Chinese diaspora. So the largest diaspora in Latin America have been the Chinese. And again, it's nothing, Evelyn Hude-Hart, who writes a lot about this, says 1613 in Lima, you see 1635 in Mexico. But a lot of the migration did take place in the 1800s when we see modernization, Chinese coming from China to work on railroad creation, like we saw with the Panama Railroad in Panama. Often the Panama Railroad is being built in the mid-1800s. You had a lot of Chinese migrants coming, not just to help build that railroad, but also to help bring gold from the gold rush in the United States down to different countries in Central America, right? Also working on infrastructure development, shipping, and other labor-intensive exercise and areas. And it's interesting because Evelyn Duhart says they were really recruited for cheap labor. And she says there's different waves. So you had the early wave in the 1600s, you had this wave in the mid 1800s. And then in terms of Latin America, you had a wave of Chinese immigrants going to Latin America really towards the latter part of the 1800s and even the early parts of the 1900s, where we see things like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, barring migrants from coming to the United States. And thus then Latin America becomes a little bit more desirable, right? She says, even though, again, on the positive side, you have these themes of mestizaje, and you also see a lot of miscegenation and assimilation, positive and negative. I'm going to quote her. She says, still across the centuries, not just Chinese, but Asians in the Latin American popular imagination are seen as an undifferentiated mass of Chinos, along with tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese. So that's still problematic. So a lot of besides coming to Panama, which I'm going to talk about in a second, actually Panama has the largest migration from China out of all the countries in Central America. But when you look at the numbers, a lot of the migrants came in the mid 1800s, really went from Peru and then mostly Cuba. And there's some really good literature. I know there's a artwork here that's depicting Asian migration in Cuba. But there's really sort of literature that I was reading for this talk that's interesting, a debate among scholars about, Chinese immigrants and immigrants from Asia coming to Latin America at the time that in Latin America and the United States, when slavery was being abolished, right? People were opposed slavery. So the question was, being paid very low wages, working on these contracts for 3 years in agriculture, indentured servants, was it a new form of slavery? And I was reading before this that Evelyn Duhart, she actually argues it wasn't a new form of slavery when you look at specific instances in Cuba, where on the, despite the harsh realities, there was still some of the Chinese migrants that had come in, or immigrants that come in the 1800s, worked for their free labor after a number of years. So I encourage you to read more about that. That was sort of fascinating to me. Okay, so finally, let's look, well, at the end of the 20th century, you have 55 million Chinese living outside of China, according to Professor Duhart, with 3.5 million living in Americas. Again, I said 4 million before, so around that. Okay, Laura Fong Prosper. She is a video artist, as you know. She's born in 1978. She was born in Panama, and now since 2007, she's lived in Berlin. And she does all different types of artwork, not just video, but she does do other types of medium as well. And the piece that I want to focus on is De Donde Nació, Where Was He Born? And I found this is an amazing, I don't know, it's a 25-minute video art, which usually when I watch, it's a documentary though too. Usually, when I watch documentaries of mass media sitting down. So I was fascinated by this because she uses different images, uses old cameras. I was reading about her process. It's a very elaborate process, the way she put this together, but it's really about her growing up and identifying as Panamanian, but identifying also as her dad was Chinese. Her grandfather came from China when he was 12 years old to Panama. And her mother, who came from the Caribbean, and actually she said has sort of Afro-Indigenous roots. So that's her sort of next project, right? So she's growing up very sort of in this family that's ethnically very mixed in Panama, in a community where you don't have many people that identify as ethnic Chinese, right? And she decided she'd always longed to go back to China and sort of discover her roots. And so she makes this, I think it was around 2011, 2012, she goes to China and she looks up, it's a fascinating video, please take time to watch it. She looks up, the address, where she finds where her great grandparents once lived. And she actually, it's amazing. She actually finds the address. She sees the name Fong there, and she finds the sister of her grandfather still alive. She's the youngest sister in China. So it's really an amazing journey of self-exploration. What does it mean? How does she identify? So I guess I could talk about some of the. I'm not I'm sort of amateur in terms of analyzing art, but I can say some of my takeaways here. Some of your takeaways. Some of the takeaways are that she identifies, she's like, even though she's Chinese, she really realizes she's Panamanian, she's different, talks about that feeling alone and isolated, but also feeling part of the community as well while she's in China. Uses, in this video, she uses really bright colors, and she says a lot of the bright colors that she uses are reflective of her Panamanian roots, right? She also says when she was there for like a year and a half, just taking videos, constant videos. And she's amazing because she uses sort of recycled cameras, recycled film. And she says that she didn't have it planned out, the process of making this video. And in fact, when I was talking to the curator of this project the other day, Adriana Ospina, she said when they first started this exhibit that Laura Fong Prosper said, you know what, I have all this material. Can I please make a video art to put in the installation? So this exhibit also sort of spurred her to make this. And so she says, and you read, I don't know if Alice is here, but Alice, who works here in the museum, gave me a lot of material. And one of the articles about her work says that serendipity is really, everything in this video, the way it comes together is serendipity. She doesn't know where she's going with the process. She takes sort of the recycled tools, right, that she takes to China. She doesn't like newer footage. She likes older cameras. In fact, and I don't know much about this as well, but she uses sort of older cameras. She took a lot of the images, she burnt them on DVDs, then used some type of synthesizer, put them on a TV, and then videos the TV as well. So she's able to have these layers in the background. So again, so I thought it was amazing. She brings us back to the concept of mestizaje, but throughout the video, this El Tiempo es Circular, she brings us back to that. This time is circular, because she's thinking about her grandfather and her great grandparents growing up in China. And then she goes back and actually encounters her family. But what I found really interesting, I encourage you all, if you're in, do I have like 1 minute left? 1 minute? Okay. What I found interesting, and I encourage you all, if you're interested in this topic, there's an anthropologist at NYU. The person's name is Lok Su, S-I-U. And The article that Laksu published in 2002 that I was reading parts of is Cultural Citizenship of Diasporic Chinese in Panama. And I found that I'm going to relate it back to what I find, it relates to this topic, the concept is circular. In this article, Laksu talks about the reception of Panamanian Chinese, first of all, in current day, whether they're newer immigrants or older immigrants, because she comes to Panama in 2002, around that time, and immediately she's detained, and then she's, she discusses how race is still conflated with nation and whatnot. But she realizes the Chinese that come to Latin America and Panama in the 1980s during sort of the third wave, where there's an opening under Deng Xiaoping, and later, versus the Panamanian born or those that had come much earlier, they're treated differently, even within the Chinese diaspora community in Panama. And so she found that what was interesting, even though there was this tension, and she was interviewing, sort of ethnographic research, the Chinese diaspora in Panama about how they didn't like the sort of newer immigrants, the older immigrants, right? She said there was a moment after the invasion, after Noriega was removed, where there was horrible state repression against sort of the new Chinese diaspora, and some of them were going to the United States. And all of a sudden, the older, the newer immigrants came together in Panama and rallied together and supported one another. But she realized that they didn't come together because of some essentialized Chinese identity. They came together because of memory of the older generation being persecuted in the 1940s in Panama, actually, with exclusion laws and whatnot. And so she says, the author, they identified with recent immigrants because they saw themselves occupying a similar position of marginality within the Panamanian nation state, or the shared memories of immigration and collective positionality through the Panamanian nation state. And I thought about that because sometimes we think, especially, somebody who I don't study migration much, and I don't study ethnicity much, and sometimes you think, oh, they're Colombian, or they're Panamanian, or they're Peruvian, or they're, like myself, Ukrainian, right? And you might identify with other people of that similar nationality. But instead, it had me thinking about this video. Perhaps her pilgrimage, Laura Fung Prospers, and anybody's, to search for one's roots is not about a shared identity based on ethnicity or DNA, but rather the collective memory of migration in general. Laura says in her video that she becomes sort of like a vessel, right? She did this for her grandfather. And it was a shared learning and understanding of her grandfather's migration from China and his life that she was sharing with his sister that she met. So it's a journey of migration that is shared and brings a family together, where the messages resides. So thank you very much, and it was an honor to speak to you today. Thank
you, Cathy. That was fascinating. I love that story about Laura's, the complexity of Laura's work that you explained so well. And please join us at the Arthur Ross Gallery to see the exhibition in person. It is open every day except Mondays, and the exhibition will be on view through May 23rd. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Like you said,